Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're looking at the recently released Metro Exodus and seeing how it compares to its initial 2017 E3 debut. For this video, I'll be running Metro Exodus on the PC with an RTX 2080 Ti, an i7 8700K processor, and 32GB of RAM. I did play around with the ray tracing effects initially, but since ray tracing wasn't officially confirmed to be in Metro Exodus back in 2017, it's likely that the original footage didn't utilize this feature, and so I'll be disabling this effect. Also, bear in mind that the footage on the left will appear blurrier because of YouTube compression, so textures may not appear as crisp as they appeared initially. Alright, so starting off, let's look at some various textures and object models, starting with Artyom's gear. First, the wrist-mounted watch and Geiger counter has been redesigned to appear more clearly during gameplay. The watch has had a few new details added to it, and the small blue LED has been moved slightly. Also, the blue electrical tape has been removed from Artyom's arm. You'll notice that the shotgun appears brighter, and that's because the retail version now shows light from Artyom's headlamp on the end of the weapon. Other smaller details like scratches are a bit harder to make out than the E3 demo, but the overall model appears mostly the same. Artyom's crossbow, which is shown later, is practically identical, with only the tiniest changes in surface textures, which likely can be attributed to the bad compression. Now, I typically would transition into talking about the environment, but let me save that for later when I detail the full list of changes to the level layout, and instead talk about lighting next. The lighting in Metro Exodus is incredible, even without the ray tracing enabled. The lighting in some of these scenes might not be identical to the E3 demo, but that could very well have been. So it's not necessarily a downgrade if you see any changes in the design here, but more so an artistic choice. There's plenty of examples of beautiful volumetric light shafts, god rays, and global illumination all throughout. The one thing I will say though is that the bloom on Artyom and his weapons has been downplayed a bit, though I think this may have been for the best, as it's often exaggerated in video games. Now, for the rest of this video, I'd like to go scene by scene and detail all the changes to the environment's layout and the gameplay experience, but I'll also point out any changes to things like effects and lighting along the way. The E3 demo starts with the player moving down a tunnel filled with watchers. However, this same tunnel in retail is inhabited by spider bugs instead. The jump scare with the watchers still happens, only it happens at the very start of the game, back in the Moscow metro system. So let's examine that scene more closely. First, the player moves down the tunnel towards a few abandoned vehicles. The abandoned van with skeletons that the player grabs some supplies from in the demo is still in the final game, but instead of the cave appearing dry and covered in a thick layer of dust, the cave now has more deep puddles with algae growth and other plant life taking over. Next, the player walks up to a doorway and slowly pushes it open with their free hand. The doorway location is similar in its design, but appears much darker in the final product. Also, the player animation when opening the door doesn't trigger here, though I have seen it throughout the game a few times. Next, the player pulls out a lighter and burns the spider webs. This effect still looks great, though it arguably looked better before. Also, a spider runs across the screen here, which I'm not sure if this triggers every time at this spot because it happens a lot throughout the game. And then we have the jump scare, which is not nearly as effective in the final game. Rather than smoothly transitioning into a cutscene like before, the game jerks the camera towards the dark corner so that the same watcher jump scare can play out. This jump scare sequence is mostly the same, though with some slightly modified angles and coloration due to the flashlight being on in my footage, but the model itself is roughly the same level of quality. After this encounter, the two versions begin to differ drastically. The scene in the E3 demo looks incredibly pre-rendered, with the player smoothly charting to shoot enemies as he clears rooms towards the ladder. The retail version, however, makes this a tutorial opportunity to introduce the combat mechanics, and lets players face several of these watchers in a much larger area in the tunnels. Eventually, both versions reach a door, and a cutscene plays with the character attempting to open a door as a watcher slides in from behind, smashing into a box and kicking up a load of dust that is properly illuminated by the window above. However, this dust isn't in the final game, and wouldn't be as visible considering this section takes place deeper underground. This is where the demo deviates completely. In the E3 demo, the player runs outside, fights off the watcher, and then dramatically turns around to reveal the massive outdoor environment. In the final game, this same animation plays out, but the player instead turns around and is faced with more of the dark metro system. The big reveal of that same church area is in the retail version, but also plays much differently. In the final build of the game, the player opens this door and an ally jumps out blocking the view. This character then proceeds to guide you through most of the area, in a way to tie up the narrative in the location. From here, I tried my best to follow the same path used in the demo, but there's some significant changes that can't be avoided. First off, the path from the muddy slope to the church is much longer in the final build of the game. You can even see some new structures that were never in the demo, in addition to a massive chasm between the church area and the rest of the town. The ground here is slightly different, with more wet ground in the final build and a more shallow slope, making it difficult to slide down smoothly. Also, the tractor at the bottom of the hill went from being brown to a rusted blue, though I'm not quite sure why. Moving on, another major change has been made. As the player travels past a rusted car, the weather immediately begins to shift into a storm system, and the environment gets a lot darker. The building to the right has the same amount of detail, but it's harder to make out because of the much darker lighting. Sadly, the wolves are no longer a part of this section of the game, and instead appear much earlier in the game. The animation where the player retrieves a crossbow bolt from a dead wolf still occurs, only much earlier in the level, and even is extended with the player wiping the blood off on his sleeve. Unfortunately, this animation only happens once, and the player will just instantly retrieve bolts from enemies killed after the initial wolf. The window that the player climbs out of in the demo cannot be climbed out of in the final build. However, the vaulting animation is still present, and occasionally works in windows in other parts of the game. And finally, we have the big mutant bear fight. In the E3 demo, the player runs into a large pack of wolves who suddenly flee after a bear bursts out of the church doorway. This scene doesn't ever happen, at least not under these circumstances. Earlier in this section of the game, the player will run into the bear near a different church with a large combat area to fight him in. The bear breaks through the door in a similar manner and triggers a lengthy fight, but the player cannot use explosive bolts to stun the bear and send him stumbling down a cliff, which I think we all knew wasn't very realistic for an actual gameplay situation. The final build instead triggers a final confrontation with the bear after crossing the bridge to the church, and after dealing enough damage, a cutscene will automatically play where the bear falls off the cliff. A bit disappointing, honestly. But the zipline's still there, and this scene plays very similarly, with the player ziplining towards a speeding train and being pulled aboard, only some of the characters have been shifted around for the sake of the story. As far as E3 demos go, Metro Exodus does manage to deliver on most of its promises. Everything featured in the E3 demo happens one way or another. I was surprised to see things like retrieving the bolt from the dead wolf and the gorgeous visuals, but was disappointed with some of the abrupt shifts into cutscenes considering how smooth it all looked in the demonstration. Still, the overall visual appearance of this location is just as impressive in the final game, with leaves blowing in the wind and an extraordinary level of detail. I can't stress enough how beautiful the actual final build of this game is, and the gameplay experience isn't half bad either. I'm going to try and have a full review for this game later this week, so be sure to stay tuned for that. Also, if you'd like to learn more about the Metro series, be sure to check out my History of Metro video linked at the end. Thank you all for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this posted every week.